You're listening to the Weekend Sport Podcast with Jason Pine from News Talk ZB.
One of the most recognisable voices in sport over the last 40 years in this country has been that of John McBeth. He's been the commentator for some of the most famous sporting moments in our history, with the ability to turn his hand, or more correctly, turn his voice, to pretty much anything from rugby to athletics, swimming to sailing, multiple Olympic and Commonwealth Games and Rugby World Cups, the face and the voice of the America's Cup from San Diego for about 10 or 15 years. Some of the most famous moments in that sport had his voice attached. Gold medals, famous tries, victories and defeats, which are still talked about today, and much, much more in between. John McBeth has written his autobiography. It's called It's Over, a broadcaster's story. And John McBeth is with us. Can we start with the title, John? It's over. Is that a rugby phrase, or does it relate to your career behind the mic? Surely that's not over, John.
Well, it pretty much is, I think, Jason. You know, I looked at it and I gave some examples of friends telling me what if I was to write a book, what it could be called, and, you know, a great face for radio and all that sort of thing, you know, those humorous things, however accurate. And I thought, you know, it was a phrase that commentators, as you've used so many times, when the final whistle goes, you know, it's over. And for me, a goal being kicked in rugby, it goes over the crossbar, it's over. And then once I found that I pulled out of the last Olympic Games and the last Winter Olympics because of COVID. And once you do that with an international broadcasting company, your name sort of gets scratched off the list, basically. And I thought, well, that's pretty much it. So I thought then maybe doing international events is over for me. I'm still dabbling, but that was it. And I have been asked by a few people why. It sounds as though you're at death's door or something.
Yes,
that's the reason for it.
Well, I'm glad it's not an obituary. That's good to know. But how did you find the process of writing your life story?
Most awkward. I was reluctant to even start it because I had no idea of how to start. I asked a few people and they said, just start from when you were born. And I thought I didn't want to do a chronological sort of book because I've read those and I find them, a bit tedious, and people do skip over and get to the meat when you're reading those sorts of things. So I wrote my first chapter, which was quite a tragic moment in our lives when one of my brothers was killed in a car crash, and I thought that was a significant one. I wanted to get that chapter done for my family, basically. And then I just took that from there and thought, how do I actually start this? So then I went back to when I first dabbled in commentary work full-time and how I got the job at Carisbrook way back in the mid-70s. So from then on, it sort of flowed, but it was a lot of work, Jason, and you've been involved in the book writing process. You know what it is like. I went through, diaries which had some comments in there, and they produced memories, and I started then researching and going back, and the process took, I say it took 6 years. It was probably more than that. But, gee, I talked to Kevin Milne about it, the former Fair Go presenter. He said, well, how come it's taking you so long? I did mine in 6 months.
Good old Milne. Yeah, good on him. So, at the risk of being chronological about this, John, how did it all begin for you in a broadcasting sense?
Well, I went down to Koorau recently, to the Koorau Rugby Club, for their 125th. Became famous because Richie McCaw played there and so on. Well, that was where I was born, and it was great chatting to people down there about, those old days when I was born and years since. But my life really started in Timaru, where I grew up and went to school and began broadcasting. I was playing rugby like most of us. There weren't too many options, Jason. There were a few people that dabbled in football, but basically smaller places were rugby. I got injured. I was listening to the radio. I was working on the radio station and the music side of things then, and I wanted to find out how my team was getting on, and you had to wait until 6:30 at night to find out results. So I just went to my boss at the time and said, how about I come into the studio and ring around the grounds and get some scores going. So that was how that really started, but full-time was in Dunedin, where you are at the moment at what was 4ZB, and I applied for and got a full-time sports job when the NZBC split up to become TV1 and Radio New Zealand and so on. So from there, I went to the Carisbrook job when Ian Galloway retired and they were struggling to find a replacement. I put my hand up, eventually was given a go, and from then on, it just went. Most unexpectedly too, Jason, I thought sitting at Carisbrook was great. That'll do me. I thought, great. I don't care even if when John Howson comes down and the touring team is there, he does the commentaries. That didn't worry me. I didn't think that I'd ever join Winston McCarthy and Bob Irvine and John Howson as the four first national radio rugby commentators.
Yeah, but you did, and obviously your career branched from radio into television, and back and forth, I guess, in those two broadcast mediums. Did you have a preference, John, commentating on television or on radio?
I found the transition to TV quite difficult, Jason, because as a radio commentator, you're the listener's eyes. Basically, you're painting a picture all the time, and your word usage is far greater than it should be on television. And certainly back in those days, there was a marked difference. I do believe these days that you couldn't tell the difference between really radio and television commentaries in general. But in those days, it was very, very disciplined, where there were lots of pauses, and you were trying to enhance the viewer's appreciation of what was happening, not stating the obvious. Whereas radio is absolutely stating the obvious all the time. So I found that transition quite difficult, but I thought, after a certain period of time, I'd handled it well. But there were a lot of difficulties, and I go into it in quite detail within the TVNZ as I was then, that the structure of not being kept in the picture. Honestly, sometimes I'd come home and thank goodness my wife was working at the time, because she said, it looks as though you're going to get the chop. So there was all that sort of pressure on, and I think these days I would be claiming mental health, because there was enormous stress involved in my introduction to television, but eventually it became smooth, and eventually I began to really love it, and it became I think very adaptable, and that's why I did all these various sports that you've mentioned. So I just kept putting my hand up, Jason, and saying yes when sometimes I should have said no.
Well, you've alluded there, John, to some professional setbacks and the personal tragedy too, the loss of your brother Ray in that car crash on the day you were commentating, actually, a Southland and touring French rugby game. Colleagues who have gone before their time. Were you keen to make sure that the book had light and shade in it?
Absolutely, yeah. I was reluctant to even put those sorts of, serious things in. It's quite a bit of family story in there as well. But I certainly, people who know me, Jason, know that, it's generally light in there. Humour and levity, and but also quite good sensitive stuff. That took a while to do those sorts of stories, but I'm pleased I did. It goes back to why I did it. It was initially began when one of our sons started interviewing me and said, I would need to find out more about your life. I mean, you missed 8 of my first 15 birthdays because you're overseas. I want to find out what you were doing and why you were doing it. And I said, I'll do that for family. He didn't follow up, but I did. So it began a sort of a family story, as often happens. And then, various people said, you may as well do a complete story. So I'm hopeful that's what it is.
How do you reflect back on the America's Cup broadcast that you were a part of? Because they have become simply iconic. Not just your part in them, John. Obviously the whole thing, but watched by hundreds of thousands of people. Some of the most famous America's Cup moments, and you there fronting, but also having to fill hours and hours of program.
I often looked back on that and thought, how the hell did I do it? 6 months in San Diego, and working with, of course, with PJ, who is the voice of New Zealand yachting, but, myself and people like Peter Lester and Jan Sher and Glenn Sowry, I'm talking about San Diego only here, we basically became the faces of it. And it was at a time, 1995, a time where communication wasn't quite so easy. Social media wasn't there, and we were getting faxes from New Zealand and photos showing people queued up in Lambton Quay, in Wellington, for example, outside TV shops watching the coverage. We then found out, about people wearing the red socks and people who had no idea about sailing at all were watching the America's Cup, and so it stunned us, really. We were part of an historic moment in New Zealand sport, and hour after hour, you're quite right, I'd sit in this area, mainly outside in the San Diego sun, and without any auto cue at all. So it was all ad-libbing and at times taking instructions from a director to just basically start talking, John, with no idea what was going to come out of my mouth. But it went on and on, but it was so rewarding. And basically I think that saved my career too, Jason, as an aside. But that was magnificent. And it was, I look at some of the historic things I've been involved in, and that's one. And when people ask, what are your highlights over years of commentating rugby and so on, I say, I've got to place America's Cup, Danyon Loader, World Rugby Cups, all up there as real highlights.
Which sport did you enjoy commentating the most?
It actually turned out that the one that I'm doing now, as in years ago, I just fell in love with those sports and concentrated and devoted my time to it. Obviously, rugby was the key sport for me, which got me my breaks initially. But as it went on with swimming, of course, the highlights of that. And a sport which I never even knew anything about till I went to my first Winter Olympics was biathlon. It's a race, and it involves skiing and shooting, and I just could not get enough of that. So I'd float, really. I'd say this is the best one for me. Curling is great, or it's swimming here, or synchronized swimming there, or But my involvement with those major events, particularly the Olympics, where I did several different sports, ending with Lisa Carrington, she is the most successful Olympian of all time. Canoeing, which I'd only dabbled with. So every sport brought great joy to me.
Did you get nervous before big commentaries?
I'd lie awake at night thinking about it, particularly in the early days, and particularly when it really was an important event. There were periods for example, in San Diego, where, I'd just be a nervous wreck. Going into, like for an Olympic final or something, when Loader was fronting up, I just kept going over in my mind, what am I going to say, and still stuffed it up. I'd always, I'm one of those people, Jason, who felt that if you weren't at least a little bit on edge, you weren't going to fire on all cylinders. Mm.
And you say it's over, but you say you dabble, and your commentaries at the last Olympic Games of the canoeing and the rowing in particular just brought those events to life, and they were, obviously hugely successful for those two sports as well. Is it over, John? Paris is only next year.
Yeah. No, I won't go to Paris. You know what? There are other events that I've done, Jason. Like I notice now the World University Games are on at the moment. The World University Olympiads are far bigger than the Commonwealth Games, for example. And one of my last trips was to Krasnoyarsk, Siberia, to commentate on the World University Winter Games. So there are those sort of things out there, Asian Games and Southeast Asian Games and so on. But I think probably, the COVID situation, hauled me back quite a bit in my travel. The travel doesn't appeal to me like it used to. However, with the way things are moving, and I'm involved in quite a lot of bowls commentary at the moment for Bowls New Zealand, I sit in my lounge and do it off a laptop and with a headset, and I can be one commentator at my home in Raumati, someone else, for example, Joe Edwards was in Nelson doing the same commentary with me, and the event was in Dunedin. So, it might not be over if I don't have to travel so much.
Fair enough. And what else takes up most of your time these days, John? You mentioned bowls. I know you're heavily involved in that sport on the Kapiti Coast. What else takes up most of your time?
Well, it has taken up a great deal of my time. I still go out and do a few, speeches. It's mainly to sort of probus groups and that these days. But I get a kick out of that. I'm a funeral celebrant, which sadly keeps me quite busy, although it's flexible enough for me to be able to say no when I want to do other things. Family takes a bit of time, a couple of grandkids, and I'm, gardening and all those sorts of things. And, we plan to do a wee bit more travel as well. But catching up with good mates is important too. Jason, it does sound as though it's over, doesn't it? God, I should have changed it to it's nearly over.
I was going to say we could maybe just if there's a reprint, we could squeeze another word in there to the title. Right. And yeah. And speaking of the book, how can I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to read it. How can people get a copy of it?
I didn't expect so much interest, and there has been quite a bit of interest, and I've been using just an email address, so I've been handling it myself. It's self-published, and the email address is McBeth Tartan, so that's Macbeth with no A's in it, McBethTartan23@gmail.com. There are a few Paper Plus outlets have inquired about it, so I know there's one in Piney that has got a few books there, and other Paper Plus people have been just contacting me to see if they could stock it, and so it's a matter of going in and asking. There are 2 or 3 little bookstores, one in Timaru, for example, where it all started, Jason.
Yes.
So it really is a matter of asking, but certainly that email address, McBethTartan@gmail.com, that'll be the one that gets instant reaction.
Terrific, John. It's been so good to catch up. I feel like we could talk for hours. I love the book. It's a cracking read. Congratulations on completing it and on a wonderful career that's inspired many people, myself included. So thanks for taking the time for a chat this afternoon.
That's delightful of you, Jason. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. John McBeth there, the unmistakable voice of one of our great sports broadcasters. His book is called It's Over, A Broadcaster's Story, and that email address again is the probably the best way of inquiring about getting a copy, McBethTartan23@gmail.com, McBethTartan23@gmail.com.
For more from Weekend Sport with Jason Pine, listen live to News Talk ZB weekends from midday or follow the podcast on iHeartRadio.